February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima, in the volcanic black sand south of Mount Suribachi. A Japanese major named Yoshio Tanaka stood inside a concrete bunker, watching through a firing slit as the second wave of American landing craft came ashore, and felt something he had not expected to feel after 18 months of studying exactly this moment. He felt the timeline collapsing. Tanaka had helped design part of the defensive network on this section of beach, working from a doctrine his superiors had drawn directly from the bloody lessons of Tarawa and Saipan and Peleliu, islands where Japanese garrisons had inflicted catastrophic casualties on American assault forces by forcing them to cross open killing ground under interlocking fire from concealed positions. Iwo Jima had been built, deliberately and methodically, to be the worst version of that lesson yet. 11 miles of tunnels, hardened bunkers sited with overlapping fields of fire. Artillery registered on every plausible landing point months in advance. Japanese commanders had studied American assault patterns from 3 years of island fighting and built a defense specifically engineered to exploit the predictable rhythm of an American beach landing. The pause to regroup after the first wave, the bunching at natural choke points, the methodical, by-the-book advance that earlier battles had taught the Japanese to expect. What Tanaka was watching through that firing slit did not match the rhythm his defense had been built around. The Marines coming ashore were not pausing at the obvious choke points. They were not bunching where the original American assault doctrine, the doctrine of Tarawa 16 months earlier, would have predicted. Squads were moving in small, fluid teams, flanking positions the moment they were identified, rather than assaulting them frontally. Tank infantry coordination that had been clumsy and improvised on earlier islands was, on this beach, executing maneuvers that looked rehearsed because they were rehearsed, drilled specifically, in the months before this landing, against mock-ups of exactly the kind of defense Tanaka had helped build. Tanaka had read the intelligence summaries. He knew the Americans had taken brutal losses at Tarawa. He knew Peleliu, fought only months earlier, had been one of the costliest fights of the entire Pacific campaign, with American casualty rates that should have forced a complete reconsideration of amphibious doctrine. He had expected, reasonably, that an American force assaulting an even more heavily fortified island would either hesitate, suffer catastrophically, or both. Instead, in the space of 18 months and across 4 major assaults, something in the American military had gotten faster. Not braver. The Marines had never lacked for courage, and Tanaka did not doubt that for a moment. Faster, more adaptive, capable of absorbing the lessons of one bloodbath and arriving at the next with a meaningfully different set of tools. Tanaka would not survive the battle to write a full account of what he was thinking in that bunker. But Japanese officers across the Pacific campaign, in captured documents and post-war interrogations, kept returning to a version of the same bewildered observation. The Americans seemed to learn from their dead in a way that Japanese doctrine had no mechanism to match. Hold that thought, because the question this video is going to answer is not why the Marines were tough enough to take these islands. They were. That was never in question. The question is how an institution as large and as bureaucratic as the United States Marine Corps managed to rewrite its own doctrine repeatedly in the months between one bloodbath and the next, fast enough that the lessons of November 1943 were already reshaping the landing craft, the fire support, and the small unit tactics used in June 1944, and reshaping them again before February 1945. To understand what changed, you need to start at Tarawa. Because Tarawa is where the United States Marine Corps learned, in the worst possible way, that its pre-war amphibious doctrine had a fatal gap in it. The 2nd Marine Division landed on the atoll of Baishio, part of the Tarawa Group, on November 20th, 1943. Naval planners had assured the assault force that a sustained pre-landing bombardment would neutralize the Japanese defenses. The bombardment was, in fact, the heaviest naval and air preparation yet applied to a Pacific landing. It did not work the way it was supposed to. The Japanese garrison, roughly 4,500 men, under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had spent over a year constructing a defense of concrete bunkers, steel pillboxes, and interlocking machine gun positions dug deep enough to survive the bombardment essentially intact. Then the tide turned against the Marines, in the most literal sense possible. An unusually low neap tide stranded landing craft on the offshore reef hundreds of meters from the beach, forcing thousands of Marines to wade ashore under direct machine gun fire, carrying their equipment through water in some places chest deep, with no cover, for a distance that turned a landing into a massacre before a single man reached dry sand. Roughly 1,000 Marines were killed and over 2,000 wounded in the first 76 hours, on an island barely the size of a large city park. The American public, when photographs of dead Marines floating in the surf were eventually published, was horrified. Congress demanded answers. The question being asked at every level, from the families of the dead to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was simple and brutal. How had this happened, and how would the Marine Corps make sure it never happened again? This is the moment that matters most in this entire story, because the answer the Marine Corps gave was not a press statement. It was a process. And the process is the actual subject of this video. Within weeks of Tarawa, the Marine Corps had convened what would become a defining institutional habit of the Pacific War, a formal, structured after-action review, conducted not as a courtesy or a bureaucratic formality, but as a mandatory mechanism for extracting every usable lesson from a battle before its survivors had even finished recovering from it. Officers who had commanded at every level, battalion, company, platoon, were debriefed in detail. Landing craft coxswains were interviewed about the reef and the tide. Naval gunfire officers were questioned about why the bombardment had failed to destroy bunkers that intelligence had assessed as vulnerable. Engineers examined captured Japanese defensive positions to understand exactly how they had survived the preparatory fires. The review process did not stop at identifying what had gone wrong. It was structured, deliberately, to produce specific, actionable changes to equipment, training, and doctrine. Changes that could be implemented before the next operation, not studied at leisure for some future war. The results were concrete and fast. The amphibious tractor, the LVT, a tracked vehicle that could climb a reef and deliver Marines directly onto a beach without the wading exposure that had killed so many at Tarawa, had existed before Tarawa, but had been used in limited numbers and treated as a secondary asset. After Tarawa, LVT production and allocation were prioritized aggressively. By the time of the Marshall Islands campaign, less than 2 months later, in January 1944, amphibious tractors were carrying the first waves ashore in numbers that fundamentally changed how a landing under fire actually happened. Naval gunfire doctrine was rewritten to demand longer, more deliberate bombardment, specifically targeting hardened positions rather than general area suppression. Underwater demolition teams, combat swimmers tasked with reconnoitering and clearing obstacles before landing, were expanded and given a mandate that traced directly back to the reef that had stranded Tarawa's landing craft. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it is the actual mechanism behind everything Major Tanaka would observe, with growing alarm, over the following 18 months. The Marine Corps had built an institutional process that treated each battle's casualties not only as a human tragedy, which they were, and which every Marine Corps officer involved in these reviews understood with total clarity, but also as a data set, a body of evidence to be studied with the same rigor an engineer applies to a structural failure, specifically so the next group of young men sent ashore would face a problem that had already been partially solved by the deaths of the men who went before them. The Japanese military, by contrast, operated under a doctrinal and cultural framework that made this kind of systematic, institution-wide learning extraordinarily difficult to replicate, not because individual Japanese officers lacked intelligence or tactical insight, but because the structure around them was not built to circulate hard lessons upward and outward, the way the American system increasingly was. Japanese military culture in this period placed enormous weight on the honor and self-sufficiency of the local garrison commander. A defeat was, in a very real sense, expected to end with the death of the defending force, rather than its withdrawal and debriefing. The doctrine of Gyokusai, fighting to the last man, meant that the officers who had learned the most granular, specific lessons about how a particular defense had failed against a particular American tactic were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, dead before any report could leave the island. There was no Japanese equivalent of the after-action interview process the Marine Corps was running after Tarawa, because there were, in most cases, vanishingly few survivors left to interview, and the military culture that produced Gyokusai was not structured to prioritize extracting tactical data from the handful who did survive captivity. This created an asymmetry that compounded with every battle. The Americans were running a continuous, accelerating feedback loop. Fight, debrief, revise, retrain, fight again, with each cycle measured in months rather than years. The Japanese, fighting with tremendous individual courage and often superb local tactical improvisation, had no equivalent loop. Lessons that individual surviving officers might have drawn from one battle rarely reached the planners designing the next island's defenses in any systematic way, because the institutional mechanism to transmit those lessons simply did not exist at the scale or speed the situation required. Peleliu, fought in September 1944, is the battle that demonstrates this asymmetry most starkly. And it is also the battle that forced the most significant doctrinal shift of the entire island-hopping campaign. Because for the first time, the Japanese garrison had genuinely adapted. At Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa abandoned the doctrine of contesting the beach directly, the doctrine that had produced Tarawa's slaughter on the American side, and that had cost Japanese garrisons their entire defending force in the opening hours of earlier battles. Nakagawa instead withdrew the bulk of his strength into the coral ridges of the island's interior, a fortified network of caves and tunnels in terrain called the unbreakable, and let the Marines take the beach with comparatively modest resistance, only to face a brutal, grinding campaign of cave-by-cave fighting that lasted over 2 months and produced some of the highest American casualty rates proportionally of the entire Pacific War. This was, from a purely tactical standpoint, a genuinely sophisticated adaptation. Nakagawa had clearly studied what had happened to beach defense doctrine at Tarawa and Saipan and built something different. And it worked, in the sense that it inflicted devastating losses on the assaulting force. But it could not be replicated, refined, and improved the way American doctrine could, because Nakagawa's adaptation died with him. He committed suicide in his command bunker as the battle ended in November 1944, and the specific operational knowledge of exactly how his cave network had been built, exactly which modifications had worked and which had failed under sustained American assault, left the war with him. There was no Japanese equivalent of the structured Marine Corps debrief process waiting to extract that knowledge and feed it into the defense of the next island. The Americans, on the other hand, immediately began studying Peleliu's lessons with the same systematic urgency that had followed Tarawa. The brutal cave fighting at Peleliu directly shaped American tactics for Iwo Jima 4 months later. Flamethrower tank development accelerated. Demolition team tactics for sealing caves were refined and standardized, and Marine training began incorporating specific drills for fighting an enemy who would not contest the beach, but would instead force a grinding fight through prepared interior positions. This is why Major Tanaka, standing in his bunker on Iwo Jima in February 1945, was watching Marines execute a landing that incorporated lessons from Tarawa, from the Marshalls, from Saipan, and from Peleliu. 4 separate, brutal feedback cycles, compressed and synthesized into a single doctrine in the span of 15 months. He was not facing the same Marine Corps that had waited ashore at Baishio. He was facing an institution that had turned every one of its worst days into a training manual. The acceleration becomes visible in hard numbers if you compare planning timelines and operational tempo across the campaign. Between the Gilbert Islands operation in November 1943 and the Marshall Islands operation in January 1944, barely 2 months, the Marine Corps had already integrated lessons about amphibious tractor allocation and naval gunfire duration significantly enough that the Marshall's landings, against comparably fortified positions, produced dramatically lower casualty rates relative to the forces engaged. By the time of the Marianas Campaign in mid-1944, pre-landing reconnaissance by underwater demolition teams, tank infantry coordination drills, and fire support timing had all been formalized into training doctrine taught to every replacement Marine entering the Pacific Theater, meaning the lessons of Tarawa were no longer confined to veterans who had survived it. They had become baseline training for men who had never seen combat. This is the real mechanism behind the thumbnail question this video opened with. Why the Marines seem to get faster, more coordinated, more lethal with every island, even as the Japanese defenses they faced grew more sophisticated and more deeply prepared in response to exactly what the Americans had shown them in the previous battle. It was not that Americans were braver at Iwo Jima than they had been at Tarawa. Courage was a constant across every single one of these battles, on both sides, and it would be a disservice to every Marine who died on every one of these beaches to suggest otherwise. What changed was that the institution behind those Marines had built a machine for learning, a deliberate, funded, prioritized process of turning catastrophic loss into operational doctrine, fast enough that the lessons of one battle were already shaping the equipment and training of the next force before that next force had even shipped out. The Japanese military, fighting with extraordinary tactical skill and individual sacrifice at every one of these islands, never built an equivalent system. Not because Japanese officers were incapable of learning, but because a military culture built around the doctrine of fighting to annihilation, garrison by garrison, with minimal expectation of survival or extraction, structurally could not generate the same kind of compounding institutional knowledge. The lessons died on the islands where they were learned, with the men who learned them. The American lessons traveled home, got written down, got argued over in planning rooms, and came back out to the next island already built into the landing plan. Major Yoshio Tanaka did not survive the Battle of Iwo Jima. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island, fewer than 1,000 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest, in keeping with the doctrine that had shaped the entire defense, fought to their deaths or took their own lives rather than surrender. What is known of Tanaka's observations comes from a partial diary recovered from his bunker position after the battle, translated by American intelligence officers in March 1945, as part of the routine, methodical process of extracting tactical knowledge from captured Japanese documents. The same institutional habit turned now toward understanding the enemy's defense that had rebuilt American amphibious doctrine 4 times over in the preceding 15 months. The diary entry that survives, dated the second day of the battle, describes what Tanaka was watching with a kind of professional, almost mournful clarity. He wrote that the Americans moved differently than the reports from previous battles had described, and that he believed, though he had no way to confirm it from inside a single bunker on a single beach, that the American military as a whole was changing faster than any defense could be built to anticipate. He was right. And the men who would have most appreciated his diagnosis were exactly the people reading it after his death. The Marine Corps officers compiling the next round of after-action lessons, already preparing, before Iwo Jima's last cave had been cleared, to study what had worked and what had not, in case there was one more island after this one. There very nearly was. The invasion of mainland Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was in advanced planning when the war ended in August 1945. A planning process that, like everything else in this story, was built directly on the accumulated, compounding lessons of Tarawa, the Marshalls, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. The system that had gotten faster with every island was, by the summer of 1945, preparing for what would have been its largest and most costly test yet. It never had to take that test, but the doctrine it would have used, refined across 2 years of exactly the institutional process this video has traced, was ready. The lesson underneath all of it is not really about the Pacific War specifically. It is about what an institution does with its own worst days. The United States Marine Corps, after Tarawa, could have done what militaries have done throughout history when a battle goes badly: assign blame, hold a few people accountable, and move on with the underlying assumptions largely intact. Instead, it built, deliberately, urgently, under enormous political and public pressure, a process that treated every subsequent landing as an opportunity to test whether the lessons of the last one had actually been learned. That process is the real subject of this video. Not the beaches, not the bunkers, not even the Marines themselves, as extraordinary as their individual courage was on every one of these islands. The system that turned grief into doctrine fast enough to save lives on the next beach before that beach had even been named. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That is over 13 minutes of real history, and it means something that you are still here. If this reached you, if the men who waited ashore at Tarawa and the officers who turned their deaths into a doctrine that saved the men who came after them deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. It is the single most effective thing you can do to help this story find the people who care about it. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell, and you will not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. Leave it in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Pacific during the Second World War, a grandfather who waited ashore somewhere, a great-uncle who never talked about which island, tell us about them. These stories survive because people like you keep passing them forward. Thank you.